All right. Just want to thank Barbara and the folks at NoVeg, and additionally Fernando, who is sitting in as a panelist. He's probably the most smartest guy with V-Ray I've ever met, and I've learned a lot from this guy. And it's one of the reasons that Chaos Group is such a great company, is people like Fernando. Okay, so a lot of the stuff I'm covering today is pulled from courses I've done for lynda.com. I just finished my 5th one. Here's my author page. You can kind of get an idea. It includes a couple courses in Rhino and 3 on V-Ray. So the good news is I have, if you're not a member, I have a link coming up for free 10 days. So I'll show that to you in just a minute. I've also been teaching at the college level since about the year 2000. I've got a website I set up. So here it is, professor3d.com. And we have, I have the list of Lynda courses here, which we just saw, but also I post video when it's needed for my class. So there's a lot of extra stuff here, all free. And here's that link I mentioned. This is the free 10 days trial for Lynda. Last time I checked, I think they've got 3,000 or 4,000 different courses. So that's unlimited for 10 days. That's just, they're amazing and they're the best. So I'm sure everyone's heard about them. Okay, some other websites I would recommend. The McNeil website and the Chaos Group website are fantastic. McNeil in particular I really like because they've got a lot of very smart staff members. So if you buy Rhino or V-Ray from NoVeg, which you should, you can then go to these forums and it's unlimited tech support. That's just amazing. So this is part of my process. Getting better is not just learning a group of tips. It is a process. I'm always finding new ways to do stuff better and faster. Okay, so I want to jump over to the 3D file. This is my good buddy, the Penguin. My goals, I got 2 today. That's to make V-Ray easy and fun. I know that sounds crazy. If you ever opened up the option editor, you would have noticed there is like seemingly millions and millions of options here. Fortunately, I've been doing this for about 10 years, and I've kind of boiled things down to a lot of really powerful shortcuts. That's what we'll be covering today. So it's going to be a mixture of shortcuts, tips and tricks, brand new features, but also some older and more overlooked features that kind of were introduced, but you may not have noticed. So that is it, and I want to get started with the scene. The first problem I noticed with people rendering is they will get intimidated with that control panel we just looked at, and they start changing things randomly or even accidentally. That's very easy to happen. I mean, if we just opened up all these things, this is like 3 or 4 screens tall, so not recommended. The fix for problems, and typically you'll maybe, at least I did, struggled for half an hour longer saying, what setting is screwing me up? Why is my image black? Well, you don't have to do that anymore. There's a button right here called Load Defaults. What that does is it repopulates every single setting we just looked at. So that should hopefully get you back to where we are right now, and that is very powerful. A lot of people get completely lost and intimidated and can even give up. One thing I do want to make here is I'm just going to turn off these additional texture maps. We'll just keep this a little simpler, and that'll speed up the renderings as well. Okay, the other troubleshooting tip is going to sound very weird. I call this my render buddy. It's nothing more than just a simple chrome sphere, and it's actually going to be very powerful. You'll see just a minute when we start to render. It's going to be looking into the scene and kind of reflecting everything around us so we can hopefully identify problems right away. Let's go ahead and just do a quick render just to see where we're at, and then I can start talking about some of the other stuff in the scene. Let's just click on the render button. It's up here in the V-Ray toolbar. Click on R for render. So we can actually see that we got a pretty decent exposure. I mean, my viewport's a little bit messed up. We'll be fixing that just in a second. The camera's not the same size as the viewport. But I wanted to point out that our exposure is looking pretty good right off the bat with all those defaults. That is very powerful. Also, this is the Chrome Sphere Render Buddy. If we look into it, immediately we can tell that the backdrop is only 180 degrees. It goes up pretty high. We've got a couple lights here. There's the top light, which is the key light. talk about that in a minute too. And then there's a side light, a little bit lower power. So this can actually, I found it can save me, 10, 20, maybe 30% of my tests because I can see problems in the background. A common thing that will happen is maybe you have extra lights you didn't even know. They were so high they were kind of out of your view. Okay, so this is a couple troubleshooting things I recommend. Some other general things to look out for is when you're doing materials. Let's just go to the penguin's orange skin here. You've got to be careful that you have materials, especially black and whites, be pure colors. And by that I mean, if, for example, on this floor, the backdrop, you notice it's not pure white. I always avoid pure white and pure black, and the simple reason is if this was 100% white, you notice it's about 80 or 90% right here, then any highlights would cause it to disappear, right? If it's 100% white, how does it get brighter? It disappears. It doesn't get brighter. So I always pull things 10 or 20% away from pure white or pure black. That's actually very important to make things a little more realistic. So that's my material tip for today. For modeling, I'm going to switch to shaded view here. And I want to talk about having edge fillets. This may seem like it's not that important, but this is a very common beginner mistake. And you'll see these little chamfers I have. They're not that big, but these are actually critical. Any product that is going to be manufactured will have fillets on it. People may not realize that, and the reason is that the tooling would just break or not work. Or if it was manufactured, you might cut yourself. So there's practical reasons, but for rendering reasons, this is what's going to capture highlights. You've got to have fillets or chamfers. Either one will do the job. Okay. The next thing before we render is the presets. I think along with the Express toolbar, these presets are just amazing and a huge time saver. So let's go over back to the V-Ray options. And these are located up here. This is brand new to V-Ray 2.0, and they've been improved with some of the service releases as well. So we have presets for camera, interior and exterior. I'm going to ignore all those and only focus on general. The rest of those settings, I've got a couple things memorized, and that will do the job. So general will control quality, and if we do a quick preview, you'll notice that this will be done literally in seconds. I don't care how complicated your scene is. This will go really, really fast. And a lot of time that is just fine to get some a feel for the camera setup and angle and maybe the lighting. You don't really need to have this finished quality to do preliminary tests. So let's go ahead and select preview. You do have to click the checkbox there. Okay, so that'll go through, and it's non-destructive. We talked about the defaults, which changed everything. These presets only control quality stuff, so they're very selective. They just went into a couple of these areas, which I don't want to get too deep into because we're going to keep this fun and easy. So let's go back to my options. We're going to do another render here. I'm going to try to squeeze in as many as I can. So this is the thing I forgot to do earlier. Not a problem. Just click Get the View Aspect. So this will match the aspect ratio of the viewport we're looking at right now. And we can go ahead and lock that. I'm going to make this a little bit bigger for you guys, 1200. We'll kind of fill the screen, I think. Okay. Let's move the camera. Talk about camera setups here in a minute, but let's just kind of look at the little settings we just made with the presets. So I'm going to click R for render. And you can see it's got some jaggies along the edges. Hopefully you can see that. Also, we got a lot of noise. But think of the trade-off. It was a little bit messy, but this thing rendered in, I don't know, I wasn't even counting, maybe a second or two. That's crazy. If you've been doing 3D for a long time, you know that in the past you may have to go take a long break or come back the next day. So V-Ray just seems to be getting faster and faster. And this is one of the tools I use to kind of get at the optimal solution as fast as possible. Using these presets, keep them dialed down to low quality, and then you just crank them up kind of towards the end. You don't even have to do it early on or for quite a while into the process. Okay, so that was the presets. Let's talk about the next big thing we need to be aware of. It's back on the options control panel here. That is the camera. So if you've been using V-Ray for a long time or just got started, you probably may have been rendering with a default camera, so I don't recommend that anymore. Instead, we're going to use the physical camera. Fortunately, when I clicked on the defaults, this was activated. And the beauty of this is if you have any understanding of cameras, you already know how this works. So we have an F number. I'm going to leave this at 8. We have a film speed. I'm going to leave that at 100. We're never going to touch these again. Instead, we're going to go over here to shutter speed. I've got mine set at the 30th of a second. That seems to be the really sweet spot for all interior studio shots like we're doing right now, a 30th of a second. And then the great advantage of this physical camera, if it comes out too light or too dark, I can just change the shutter speed. For example, if it was, let's say it was too dark, I can just slow it down, maybe a 15th of a second, and the thing is going to look so much better. Before I started using the physical camera, if an image was too dark or light, it was quite a long process. I would have to maybe change the lights, move them closer, change their power, change the materials, make them more glossy or less glossy. So now I'm more like a photographer in the studio. I just change the shutter speed, and I can pretty much leave all the other stuff alone unless there's a specific thing I want to highlight or capture. Okay, so that is with the physical camera. Let's bump up this to about low on the quality settings here. This won't take much more time. So I'm going to let it populate. It just takes a second or two. And now without moving the camera, we're going to go ahead and render this. See what happens. You'll notice this will be quite a bit better. So for a lot of projects, this might even be final quality. I do see a little bit of noise down here. Again, I'm a fairly particular nerd. For a lot of people, this could be done. Okay, another thing I'm going to recommend is we talked about the presets and the camera, how you can use the camera to modify the exposure, which is the bright or dark levels. But at a certain point, you reach a diminishing returns. So this is when I suggest people stop the tweaking and use this very powerful feature set built in. This is we're in the frame buffer, and over here we have what's called the corrections. And there's several ways we can modify this. I'm going to recommend using curves. So if you've ever done this in Photoshop, adjust curves, it works the exact same way. So you do have to turn on use curves, and then my little control panel over here, we get a flat line. Now what's happening is V-Ray is rendering a lot of information that the monitor cannot capture. There's a lot of bright areas and dark areas that literally just don't fit on a normal monitor. I don't get into the technical reasons why. So what we can do is we can move that data into the space where the monitor sees it. So this is a very powerful finesse control. We can brighten up the bright areas, so more of the detail in those bright areas becomes visible. And then we can darken up the dark areas so that more of those details become visible on your monitor. So this is your classic S-curve. So a lot of people who have done rendering or VFX are familiar with this from Photoshop or After Effects. So it's all just kind of trial and error. I typically keep these pulled straight over. Depends on the scene. But you can see there's a lot of values here clustered towards the center. Now I've pulled in some other stuff. So what's really nice about this, I can show you a beautiful before and after. I'm going to turn the controls off here. So this is before. We actually thought this was pretty good. Now with it after, this curve is applied, and we've really not so much adjusted the colors as magnified the saturation. You just want this thing to pop, and this is a really powerful tool. So I don't even have to go into Photoshop anymore. I can make this one quick adjustment with the curves. So this is before. Looks good. I actually kind of like flat and dark images because I know they're super easy to rescue. So there it is with the curve being used. Okay, now let's talk about studio tips. This is really important. We talked about some of the technical stuff, some of the features, some of the new stuff in V-Ray. So let's talk about what you do with your camera and where to put it. So I'm going to start off with talking about, this is kind of a weird thing to say. I call this the still life without fruit. And what I mean by that is a lot of times people will just obsess and render over and over trying to make that one object or design look interesting. And to me, it just ends up looking lonely no matter what you do. I mean, here's your guy. So what I always recommend is make copies. So here is a couple of extra penguins. It's the same design. I just did a copy and paste, move them away. So this is my original master. If I want to make changes, I would just make 2 more copies and kind of rotate them. So this is getting a lot of bang for the buck. You can actually save yourself doing 3 or 4 different renders because you've got all the angles in one scene. So I recommend this technique. It makes almost every rendering just infinitely better. Okay, let's talk about the camera placement. So this is what most beginners will do. They'll just make sure that you can see everybody in the scene. Let's take a quick look at that. I'm going to keep trying to render as much as I can here. The problem I see here is it's okay, but it can be so much better. To me, this looks like somebody dropped them on the floor and walked away. This is just a weird angle. And I think the beginners typically want to see every part of all their design at all times. I don't think that's required at all. What I like to do is just get a little more dramatic, and by that I mean come in lower. So already we've got more of an interaction, or I would call it a dialogue with this character. He's right in our face, and I did that just by moving the camera down low. So I want to be somewhere, on average, is about halfway to the high point and halfway to the low point. So right about the midsection. It doesn't matter if it's a smartphone or a penguin. You want to be in the middle. And the result is I'm looking up at the higher parts, I'm looking down. So all you have to do is think about some Apple advertisements, and every one of their smartphones looks like a gigantic building because they're using the same little trick. Okay, so this is what I call better because we're down low. Let's render this. By the way, one of the features I can recommend is the V-Ray distributed rendering spawner. So if you guys buy V-Ray, you get to install the application on 9 other computers for no extra charge, and that's one of the reasons these are rendering so fast. I've got 5 computers in the office, and they're all helping out. Okay, so this rendering is complete, and this is so much better, but we're still not quite there. So I love the fact that I've got other characters or objects, and I can see how he looks from the front, from the 2 different sides, and there's actually what I call the dialogue. We've got multiple parts. You never see a still life with one fruit, so you don't want to render with one object. You've got to have a group. It's just kind of like like you would see in those paintings. Okay, so here is my best recommendation. I've got a lot of these saved as name views. Okay, so what I've done, actually I'll go back here so you can see. So this is still kind of beginner mode. I want to see every part of every character, and that's just how beginners start learning when they do rendering. So, and by that I mean there is actually no need. We've got 3 characters, so if we were to zoom in just a little bit, I'm not forgetting that he has feet, but now he looks like he is coming at me, or he's a little more 3D, he's a little more animated. So I think that's a great way to go. Feel comfortable cropping, because too many times I see people trying to get the whole thing every time. It may be fine for one rendering, but I think for your glamour shot, you definitely want to have one of the guys coming at you. And you could also compare this to like a comic book pose, a little more 3-dimensional. Another thing I might do is just give it a little bit of tipping. If you have a lineup of guys, sometimes just a little rotation of the camera can help quite a bit. But whatever you do, don't have the characters all in a straight line. To me, that just looks like what I call the police lineup. You want to have them kind of 3-dimensionally located. Close, medium, far is typically the way I do it. Okay, let's take a render now with this final setup. Okay, so that's going pretty quick. You might have noticed we didn't really have to adjust much of anything. If I thought this was too dark or light, I might go back and adjust the camera exposure, but a 30th a second seemed to work really well. I think this render here could benefit from the curve, so I'm going to do that one more time. So we can just make sure it's a little more saturated. I call this poppage. So you're just making the detail pop in those bright and dark areas. One thing I'm not sure if we mentioned, but I think it looks pretty good, is the camera angle, and that's based on the lens. I should say viewing angle. So what I recommend is when you're in the viewport and you go to properties, I'm at a 30mm lens. I didn't mention that, so that's pretty important. Most of the time, your Rhino installation will default to a 50mm. I can type that in right now, and you'll see what I'm talking about. So it looks like the camera moved. Actually, it didn't. It just got a little bit narrower. So you can go, I recommend somewhere between 24 and 30mm lens. That's kind of a wide angle. Semi-wide angle, I shouldn't say that. I think 30 works really well. Okay, just checking the time here. Let's talk about some of the elements here in this studio setup. I didn't really touch on those very much. We focused a lot on rendering. So I've got this backdrop, which is the 180 degree. It's kind of a bowl. It's really nice. Kind of this beautiful, the simple set. Make sure that's unlocked. So this is highlighted. This was straight from the studio floors. It's the 180 studio wall. There's a lot other options in here. The key, though, with your backdrop is we don't want to see edges. I've been to a lot of presentations, and I see people beginning to render, and if you can see the edge, you're distracting. You want to see a kind of a seamless environment. So use one of these bowls or something that at least goes up and it combines a wall with the floor. So just eliminate those edges. The other thing I want to just mention is the lighting. So there's a couple things that control the lighting. Actually, jump back here to perspective. This might be an easier way to see it. So you'll notice I'm using just rectangular lights. This is by far the best way to go. I notice beginners sometimes use the spotlights, which are the cone-shaped lights. I find those a little bit too harsh, and these rectangular lights look way more realistic. Also, the bigger the light, the bigger the highlight. You want that highlight to wrap across. Imagine this light if it was just for a very small rectangle or a square or even a point. You would get an equally small point reflection. So that's not going to work for most objects. You want to have a large source. You get a large reflection that wraps around the top of the characters or object, and you get soft shadows. So it's all fairly important. The other thing is placement and power. You might have noticed I've got this light selected. If I go over to the Properties panel and select on the light, this will come in as default 30, and a lot of people just don't even think to check that number. So I always put mine around 8 or 10 for the key light. And then equally important is your fill light, which is on the side. I make it half that. This is a great, simple rule of thumb to use. So 8 and 4 will usually work really well, but I could live with 5 and 10. So let me talk about the placement. We talked about the power and the type. You'll notice that this rectangular light seems a little bit close. So let me explain what's going on here. If we have a light, it kind of decays over time. Obviously, that's what makes it look realistic, like the real world. So what's going to happen is if it gets too far away, we lose that effect. By keeping it relatively close, and I'm going to say maybe 3 times the height of your tallest object, somewhere around 3 or 4, what happens is we're going to have a noticeably brighter top of the character and noticeably darker bottom of the character. That's just going to help your scene look more three-dimensional and pop. So I see a lot of people moving their light way up in space just because they didn't think about it. And you really want to have that get down pretty close. Same with the side light. I put that off to the side. I want to have these two guys overlap if possible. Not a big deal. But again, that's half power. It's a fairly good size. So let's go back to the scene in 3 dimensions, and you can kind of see what's going on here. The backdrop is, we talked about, a mistake I see a lot of people do, especially when they're starting, is they'll find a cool angle and they'll render from here. So obviously you shouldn't do that, but a lot of people forget. So try to have your backdrop in the background. And it's very simple to move if you need to. So let's say I decided this was the world's best angle right here. For whatever reason, not a problem. I can just rotate the background quickly and easily. So I would just use one of the Rhino commands to rotate it. And you can just shift that whole backdrop however you need it. But make sure it's always behind. Pretty simple to do. Okay, so that is, I think, the stuff I wanted to cover for what I call the studio or interior scenes. So I think we're right on schedule here. So I'm going to jump to an exterior architectural scene. We're going to apply some of the same stuff, but also introduce a few new things along the way. So I'm going to open up this file. It's called the Zoomerang Pavilion. Don't need to save the penguins. This is quite a big file, so it's going to take just a little bit of extra time here. I'm going to start off again with some more modeling tips, which it's a combination of rendering techniques and modeling techniques. They all kind of work together. Okay, this file is, like I mentioned, quite large. Also, I think it has a lot of texture maps. That's contributing to some of the slowdown. So let's let it finish displaying there. So let's talk about the modeling tips while it's doing that. One thing I've noticed is in architectural scenes, you can actually avoid putting fillets. I talked about how important they were. With product stuff, you can actually get away with not having fillets, and the reason is you're just not as close. So looks like our scene is finally opened up. So let me show an example what I'm talking about. We're going to come over here to one of these doors. So notice these are pretty sharp. I'm actually going to switch to a shaded view here. This might speed things up a little bit for everybody. We'll do some renders of this so you'll see all the final texture maps. So notice this is pretty sharp. There's no fillets whatsoever. But I'm not going to render this thing standing an inch away. Typically I'm going to be moving to a eyeball level, and we're going to see it in the distance, and there'll be reflections and shadows, and that will work just fine. I mean, I wouldn't put fillets on there unless you needed to. I do have a technique for that coming up. Now, alternatively is this mullion right here, this horizontal mullion. That was pretty important. I wanted to get a nice highlight on there, so I did put a large kind of a blend type radius on there. So this is called, if I didn't mention, the Zoomerang Pavilion. This is a personal project, pretty much designed just as a research and for the Linda course. Trying to do something crazy. The other thing we mentioned is the fillets, and also I'm going to call this just being sloppy modeling. So I'm usually pretty careful with product stuff. For architecture, most of the stuff is going to be hidden, kind of like on a studio set. So you'll notice if we come to the bottom here, there's just a lot of junk floating all over the place. So that's totally cool. If you don't see it, don't sweat it. You can save yourself a ton of time. I don't need to make everything nice and tight. You're not going to build typically from these files. So you're only concerned with making them look fantastic and render well. Okay, and then finally, one of my other kind of modeling or strategies here is you should set your rendering up, have it look good, but you can do so much more in Photoshop in what's called post-production, and I'll show you examples of those. We'll be looking at a lot of renderings, but it's going to be towards the end. Okay, so if you want to change the intensity or add a different background sky, or even put streaks of light from the sun, all that stuff is best done in Photoshop. So you definitely want to work smart, not hard. All right, now that we've got the tour done here, let's talk about some of the V-Ray settings I'm going to be using to render this. So let's go back to the options here. So we've got the same group of stuff. However, I should probably talk about the lighting first. I'm using the V-Ray Sun. This is one of my favorite ways to do it. We actually have another method coming up, but this is very fast and accurate. So this is the sun, which is enabled. I want to make sure that is on. This also works with two separate maps. The way these work is you want to make sure it says texture sky, And so there's nothing to see right there, but this is these three work so well together. We're going to have this this sun which we can control and move, and then we're going to have a fairly realistic sky. You may want to, it'll be up to you. There's other ways to do it if it's not to your liking, but I think for most preliminary and maybe many final renderings, this will work great. So I want to just mention we're going to be using that. Later on, we're going to be talking about this dome light. I want to make sure that's turned off now, because I only want to use one sun at a time. This is a little more advanced. So we've got the V-Ray sun. In the prior renders, we were using, if I didn't mention it, it doesn't matter because it was under the defaults. We were using the two render engines, which were Radiance Map and Brute Force. Those work great for interiors. So I didn't mention it because those were already set, but for architecture and exteriors, I'm going to use the same first engine for as a Radiance Map, but the second engine I want to use Light Cache. This will actually give us a much better result. We're going to have hundreds, if not thousands, of light bounces, and in interior-exterior, that's what really takes you to the next level. So I recommend just sticking with these two engines for all architectural work, and then use the defaults for the interior studio stuff. Okay. Some other settings we can talk about is the camera. So again, we're using the exact same stuff. f8, film speed 100, never change them, leave them alone. The shutter speed, though, I've sped up greatly. So you'll notice that when I was in the interior, it's about 30. When I'm exterior, I'm about 300. So these are two nice round numbers. I may go down to 200 depending on what I'm looking at. But those will get you by almost all the time, at least when you get started. Finally, I want to talk about one of my favorite new commands here before we render. And this is called Override Materials. Okay, so it's been turned on right now. Most people never even look here, and it's typically off. So if I were to render this scene right now, it may take 15-20 minutes to give me a nice, good size, high-quality rendering. I'm not going to do that right now. Instead, I'm going to turn on the Override Materials, and what that means is this color has been substituted for every material in the scene, every single one. And therefore, we can get renderings in seconds instead of minutes or hours. And this is actually quite powerful, just like the presets where we went fast because that was pretty good just for the camera and the light. This is a very similar, tremendous workflow enhancement. Okay, so I've got that. I do want to point out that you can, on a case-by-case basis, have that override not affect some materials. Okay, so I've got the glass not overridden. So I just think that it'll be a little more interesting to be able to see inside the building here. So that's the only one. Everything else should be the same kind of flat gray color. All right. So yes, these are architectural scenes with a lot of detail and tremendous amount of texture maps. But by using the override, we are going to get really fast results. So I'll just get it going here. I think we've already checked pretty much all the settings needed. And you'll notice this is just ridiculously fast. I mean, this is halfway done right now. And so it looks like those settings that we discussed are pretty darn close. You can actually make some slight tweaks here. For example, I think I still have my curves on. I'm going to turn those off. We got to turn it off. So this is the render as it comes out, kind of untouched. So this is right on the money. And I've been surprised once I've learned these few little settings how well this has worked. You know, pretty much just modify that camera for interior and outside, and then how well it works for almost any environment. Okay, so that's the material override. One thing I want to mention, we were just looking at the curves, is for exterior I tend to use levels. This is let's open that up and kind of explain what's happening here. I'm going to reset all of these guys so they're back to the neutral, so nothing's been modified. I'm not going to even use the curves. I tend to use those inside. I'm using the levels, and that is this dialog right here. So looking at the image, it's the same situation we had before. To me, since I've done this quite a bit, it looks really nice, really accurate, but a little flat. And you'll kind of agree with me after I make the change. So just like we used the curve, this is actually easier. We're going to make the brights a little brighter and the darks a little darker. We're going to move that information into the viewport. Super easy to do. So we can do, that's the after, here's the before. So you can really pop stuff. I call this poppage. And that might save you quite a few renderings, just trying to get it perfect. You don't have to. You can just use these enhancements. That's how people would take a photograph in the real world, and that's how they would edit in Photoshop. So you're just using the same techniques. It's not cheating. It's working smarter, not harder. Okay, typically if you're in the middle of a project, you have a lot of materials, and we took a peek there earlier. But let's say we needed to edit something, and I don't even remember what I assigned to, let's say, this chair. Right? What material is that chair in the scene? So this is really cool. Brand new command that just came out in the latest service release. It's called Edit Material. I also call it the Quick Finder. So when I click on this, notice that it's actually asking me to select it again. Okay, so I did it in reverse order. So it jumps to the material editor. If it's closed, it'll open it up, and it goes straight to the material right there. So I can make changes to that, make little additional tweaks. So it'll do that for any material in the scene, anything you can select. So for example, here is a wall, and I can just do the same thing right now. Select on the wall, right click, and then it should jump to it. So you get the idea. I'm not going to, I think I've clicked too many times in a row. It's locked up a little bit. Okay, so that's the edit materials, the quick finder. Very handy, especially as you saw when I had, who knows, maybe 50 materials. And this is especially helpful with people who aren't very good about naming. That's one thing I recommend, is have stuff that's logical. I see too many students with default material 1, default material 2, all the way down to like 40 or 50. So that's just crazy. I think that's no fun at a certain point, figuring out. It's too much of a mystery. Okay, now another really cool feature here, and I'm going to have to kind of jump outside of Rhino and V-Ray to show you, and that's this setting right here. It's called Guess Lens Shift. I want to kind of give you an extreme example to highlight what's going on. This would actually be way more noticeable if we were looking at a high-rise building. Typically, your perspective, things get very small and pointy as they get higher, right? It's converging of the verticals. Okay, so I'm going to jump over and just kind of show you the before and after of how that works. This is called lens shift. So let me point out where it is first. So right here, here's the button, guess the lens shift. And it's going to become more dramatic as you have wider angle lenses. You could actually do that. Maybe go down to 20 here. So hopefully you can see now that these vertical lines are converging. They're meeting pretty close, as opposed to where we prefer them having been more parallel. So that's what that command will do. You don't notice it in the viewport. It only happens when you render. So that's why I have to jump over here. So here is the kind of before. We did the guess the lens shift, and then the next image should be after. So that's corrected. So it does look a little bit skewed just because we're jumping back and forth. So that's the before, the lens shift, and that is corrected afterwards. So I think that's a little bit more pleasing architecturally. A lot of photographers who take pictures of real buildings will want to do this in Photoshop. So now you have a tool inside of V-Ray to do that as well. Okay, then last, for the render scenes here, let's get this out of the way. I'm going to go to a named view, and I want to render this view and show you kind of the alternative to the V-Ray Sun. This is the built-in one, or I should say the oldest, and it's kind of more standard. Let's go ahead and render this scene with the V-Ray Sun, and then we're going to talk about the new and improved dome light and the differences you can expect from that. So I've got this highlighted. Let's do a quick double check. This might be useful. So I want to make sure my environment, that's got the settings there. Check my camera, a 1 to a 300th. That should be okay or pretty close. I've got my output. Double check that to match the viewport. That looks about right. I think that's it. That's pretty much 300th. I leave everything else alone. We can double check the presets. I'm going to go very low just to keep this thing moving. That material override, though, is one of the things here that is really speeding it up. So you'll get to see the final renders here towards the end. Let's go ahead and render that. So again, this is kind of a before and after. This is, of course, our override. I already discussed that. So except for the glass. So that's why it's rendering so fast. We do have the combination V-Ray sun and sky working really nice. That blue is really popping. I don't think we're even, yeah, the levels are being used there from the last rendering. We can turn that off. So that's just going to be a comparison render. Let's talk about this new technology. First, I'm going to take the V-Ray sun and turn it off. Let's do that. Pretty easy. I'm going to select the sun there in the scene, go to the light, and just turn it off. It's off. However, it is connected to the environment stuff, so I'm going to turn off those as well. These are not needed. So that includes all the light and those specialized texture sky maps. Done. Those are fixed. Now we're going to talk about the dome light. These are both on the V-Ray panel here under lighting. You can find them. But what's really amazing about this is the fact that once you put it in the scene, I also should mention these are icons. It doesn't matter where they go. Just make sure they're not upside down. So those are in the scene anywhere. You know, it's pretty much simulating the sun millions of miles away. So not a problem where it's located. But let's talk about the settings here before we do that next render. So I'm going to enable this. Now we can apply a texture map to this dome. So what happens is we're doing multiple things at the same time. So we're providing a source of light. Also, we're providing a source for the background. And this can get really amazing and very realistic. Let's take a quick peek at the texture map here. It's just a standard bitmap, nothing special. It is an HDR format, which contains a lot of extra data. It's high dynamic range compared to your average JPEG. This is how it looks. It looks a little bit dark right here. That's fine. We're actually looking at a tiny slice of it. It's actually wrapped around this entire dome. So you just think of this as like a window on your house. You're only seeing a small section. Okay, so we've got that activated. One thing you want to look for when hunting or purchasing maps is that these guys are high quality so that the sun, there is a sun on this map, it can cast a shadow, and we'll see that happen right now. Let's go back to that saved view. It does take some trial and error, though. I've used these HDR maps anywhere from a value of 1 or 2 all the way up to 40 or 50. So a little bit of trial and error. It depends on who made them and how precise they were. Okay, let's, without any more discussion, just render this. I'm going to use a little bit of a shortcut this time. By clicking on the teapot, I don't have to go over to any of the other menus. So this should go pretty fast. The dome light will be slower in general, just because it's a little more data. But what's saving the day here is the override material. Now this looks a little darker. That's perfectly normal. We can make a very quick change, but you'll notice the scene suddenly looks like it's somewhere besides a computer. You'll notice we got the sky. The sun is actually to the right behind my shoulder. But what is a mark of a great HDR lighting map is you can see sharp shadows. There's actually just a spot on this map that represents the sun, and it is actually casting light strong enough so that your shadows show up in the scene. That's pretty nice and something that's really critical. Notice how this shadow here is from the roof edge, which is farther away, so it's actually softer. It's another huge thing to look for and another step up in realism. If I were to tweak this, turn off the levels there, I would say this is too dark. Easy to fix. We only got one thing to change. We're going back to the camera. Instead of a 300th of a second, we need to slow it down, maybe a 200th of a second. By the way, make sure your exposure is always on. If this is off, then everything's pretty much ignored. So I made that one change. Let's make sure this viewport's selected, which it is, and re-render. Again, this will go pretty fast. I'm looking at the time, so what I would like, so actually, yeah, this, I'll show you the final full color renderings here now. We'll jump over to those. So much better exposure. It's actually, I would say, fairly flat, which, as I said earlier, is perfect. So I'm just going to use my color corrections. We're going to use the levels, and right away we can brighten that up a bit or darken it up, and then kind of check the before and after. So there's the original, which is accurate but flat, and here's the one we enhanced just a little bit. You do have to be careful, though. Sometimes you can get too bright and the sky will tend to disappear. So that's a thing to look out for. Let's go back. I want to save time for questions. I know I've been talking very fast. I want to have a lot to squeeze in here, and we actually have a lot that we can maybe save for the next webinar. Okay, so here is one of the scenes with all of the materials, and one of the reasons I'd love that material override is it just saves so much time. I mean, if you look at this, almost all these materials in this scene have bump maps or displacement maps, and those take a long time. Not to mention the material maps on all these objects take a long time to get in the scene and load. So here's a nice final image. Here's a shot from the front door. I always use three-dimensional people if possible. I know in the past many people have used little cardboard cutouts. I think the technology is there where you don't have to do that. That's kind of a hack. And it's not worth the savings. It does render a tiny bit faster when you have the cardboard people who are flat, planar, but I just use 3D people from now on. Here's another example of it's using the 3D people. I don't have to worry about the angle, like I said, but also they're interacting with the scene, and that's really important. So that's one of the reasons I use three-dimensional objects like people and trees. They can interact with that scene. This rendering is kind of interesting because it's got some depth of field. I love this. This is one way that's can make the renderings just go over the top as far as realism. So just a couple things to point out here. You'll notice that I'm kind of focused on the little girl. Her father is a little bit blurrier, and as you see, get farther away, that structure is blurrier more. So that just a little bit of depth can just make things look so much more real. Next final render I want to show you is including a little bit of post-processing. So I did some tweaking, and I kind of painted a little fake sunbeam on there. And I may have modified the clouds. Here's another tree that we didn't look at, primarily because they're take up a lot of space in the file and slow everything down. But anytime I can use three-dimensional objects, and I have the time and patience to wait, I'm going to use that. It's from a company called SpeedTree. Here's another example where I just wanted experimenting, looking at some more dramatic lighting. So I just put this is with the V-Ray sun, not the dome light. So I just use a simple blue sky, and in Photoshop just kind of painted some streaks there. So making it look a little more interesting. I think also the vignette effect where it got darker around the edges. So anything you can do like that. And I think the last thing I wanted to show is an interior shot. So I think this is the only time I broke the rules I discussed today. We start off with the penguins, who were a 30th of a second, and then most of the exterior stuff was at about a 200th or a 300th of a second. So this is actually a transitional space, so no big mystery here. I just made it about a 125th or even a 60th of a second because I am indoors, but there's so much glass. It's kind of a mixture. So that is, I think that's all the highlights that I had planned for today. Oh, one more thing. I'm going to throw in a little bonus thing. Okay, so I think we have time. No one's telling me not to, so I'm going to go ahead and do it.
No, do it, Dave. Do it.
Okay. Yeah, we've talked about techniques to make architectural scenes more realistic. And one of the things I run into is CG stuff can look flat, especially in areas that are of high detail. It can kind of get washed out in this, this tendency for, and all rendering engines are the same, all 3D software. They just flatten out. So at a certain distance, these details might just disappear. So it's a great new feature. This is, again, it's been in V-Ray for, I think, a version or two. I just didn't notice it, so it's one of those overlooked things. Let's go show you where it is. This is called ambient occlusion. So I believe it's here under indirect illumination, and these are all the default settings right here. I'm going to show you before and after that are already pre-rendered. But to use it, you just turn it on. These are the defaults. That's pretty much all I've ever done. So what this does, if you were to analyze the very strange name, it takes a calculation. Let's say you're a little pixel inside this little groove here. It determines how blocked you are from the sky. So ambient light is the sky, occlusion means blocked, and then it increases some intensity values. It makes it enhanced. So smaller details or things that are blocked become enhanced, and so that tends to compensate for this tendency of all CG renderers to flatten things out. So let's look at those. Those are already done as well. So I'm going to zoom in here. Now this is without ambient occlusion. So you'll notice in the grooves we just were looking at, some are dark, some are light. They're a little bit spotty. That's one place to look. The other place to look is areas that are kind of in intersections, right? So these are just nothing special happening there. So let's go to the next image where I turn it on, and hopefully you can see that everything just popped. So these grooves became noticeably darker. This edge became enhanced, and even things inside. So let me just redo that. So here is before ambient occlusion. This is probably the most noticeable area right here. Here's after. Before, after. Big difference. Didn't take any more time to render as far as I'd ever noticed. It's one setting. That's the ambient occlusion. Fantastic. I use this for architecture all the time. It just gives you so much extra detail that you don't have to worry about. And it saves you time too in Photoshop with tweaking or enhancing, and that can be a losing battle too. All right. We have time for questions, or did I just...
No, Dave, fantastic. We have 3 questions for you. That was amazing, by the way. You got great feedback. In fact, okay, I'm going to start right now with the first question. I think you already talked about it, but let's see. How do proxy objects work in V-Ray for Rhino?
Yeah, I've actually been using those quite a bit. I don't have any in here, so I'll just try to verbally describe the best case scenario. The classic example is using trees. So this could be easily defined as a proxy. There is, it's right here. It's called Write the V-Ray proxy. If I click on it, it would write an external file. And then I could start placing those by the tens or by the hundreds. They look a little bit funny. They look very sketchy, but that's actually how they're designed. The proxy is it's a memory saving technique. So that data is stored externally and only rendered when it's V-Ray is rendering those pixels. So it pulls the data in, and then it pretty much releases it. So instead of your file being unmanageably large, the proxies can just you can literally render a forest. You can put thousands of trees. So I do use those when occasion calls for it. One thing you do got to watch out for is if I did have a proxy on here, it has what's called like a combination multi-material. So that's something you never want to touch. So to help V-Ray work during that process of rendering, it takes all the materials on the tree. There may be 5 or 6 or 7 leaves and bark and alpha channels, etc. And it combines them into one multi-material, which is kind of weird looking, and like I said, untouchable. So it'll fill up your material editor pretty fast, but it's totally worth it. Just something to look out for, and then you can render literally, like I said, an entire forest. So that's kind of what a proxy is and how it works. I didn't plan on talking about that. It's a little more advanced, but maybe you could throw that into a future webinar.
Yeah, maybe next time. Great idea. Second question, which settings bring the HDRI to the background? Is this the GI skylight, as you have not changed the settings?
Okay, I'm not sure exactly where that... All right, yeah, using HDRI background. Well, there's so many different ways to do this. I could actually render this without either of the two suns. I never want to do that. I could like this with sun and then using texture maps. But more specifically, just to what we covered today, this image that's on here is an HDR image. So let's go take a look at it briefly here. Here's the texture map. Now we can't preview much of it because it's wrapped around the dome. However, if I do a little, I'm going to switch back to a flat projection, we will be able to see the whole thing. So even though this is squashed, you can see there's a sun there, I hope. There's a sun, there's clouds, sky, and grass. So you absolutely want to have this, any image used for lighting, you want to use an HDR format. Here it is, HDR. So if you're not familiar with HDR, that just means there's more values beyond the standard 255 for RG&B, right? Everyone knows how the color wheel works. You're going to pick RG&B from 0 to 255, but that's so limiting compared to the real world. So HDR lets you have literally tens of thousands of values of R and G and B, and the result is you get trillions of colors, almost unlimited colors. And that's just pretty much what the real world is. One example I've talked about in the past is, the 255 values is very limiting. So if you were to like go outside, look under a rock, and then look at the sun, it's obviously a greater degree than 255 values could ever capture. So when you're outside, I use HDRs pretty much exclusively, whether they're backgrounds or being used for illumination. That's really why I recommend this dome light. I'm using it for both illumination and to show up in the background. That's the beauty of this dome light. So I hope I answered the question.
Right, I'm going to move on. Questions are coming in all right now, and so I will select a few because, okay, is it better to add sampling to lights or turn up the settings on V-Ray?
Can you say that again? I think I missed something.
Yes. Is it better to add sampling to lights or turn up the settings on V-Ray?
Turn up the settings?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, okay, I think I understand. Let me go back to the penguins. This is a way easier example. So from what I understand, let's go back to the props. Let's go back to the best view here. So I think the question was, do you want to modify the camera or the lighting? That's actually a really good question. I typically will use the same values here for the lights. I mean, this scene is 8 and 4 for the values. And it's something I didn't mention. There's actually, it depends on the scene. It depends on how your test renders look. So I'll put it that way, that there's a lot of variability. If you felt that the highlights are blowing out your very light colored material, then you can lower the intensity of the light or move it away or make it smaller. So that's important to know. There's 3 ways to change the light. You have 3 aspects of it. So one is moving it farther away, like I just did there. Another thing is to use a smaller light source. I could scale it pretty easily. Just snap on there, and now we have a smaller light source. Less light will come out. And then third is the intensity or the value of the multiplier here. So that's 8. So it all depends on the object. Again, I'm sorry, I'm giving kind of a it all depends type of answer. So I kind of get the lights doing what I want them to do, and then make the camera adjustments. But these settings I shared with you, I mean, they'll get you so close most of the time that I think it's really kind of up to you and what your goal is. So I'd say, if it's a super reflective material, I might be more concerned about how close and how bright the lights are. If they're more of a matte material, then the lights wouldn't be that critical, and I would probably be adjusting the camera exposure.
Cool.
But still, compared to when I started, I was literally tweaking dozens of settings. So I think you guys are in good shape. Just focusing down to 2.
That's great. Are you using a simple displacement map for the grass? And if so, are you using a noise pattern to develop the random blades?
That is, yeah, I'm actually using an existing material. By the way, there's a lot of things that go into, let's go back to the Zoomerang Pavilion. This may help. I'm using a material that comes straight out of the Express toolbar. I forgot this thing's a slow loader. It's on the Express toolbar. It's just, I think it's called N-grass. I believe it's under masonry here. Okay, it's got a lot of data here. I should have let it finish. Yeah, it's built into the Express toolbar. I think it's called N-grass or just grass. And it is, to answer the question specifically, yes, it's doing displacement. But there are specific ways you need to apply it, and important ways you need to prepare the surface. I go into a lot of detail this in the Linda course. Let's take a look at the grass. So I'm using a fairly large map, and I'm doing some repeats, but it's so well designed that you can see a little bit of the grass. So let's take a look at the material. It's called Grass N. I said N grass. It's Grass N. Sorry about that. So the key to realism here is displacement, and that's one of the reasons I didn't render this thing. This displacement is going to be one of the more time-consuming things you'll ever want to do, especially with so many blades. But the techniques I recommend, let's go back to shaded view here, is to use that material first of all, so we already know where it is. But equally important is to prepare the surface. So, but what I mean by that, let's see, I'm going to go to the object and show the ISO curves. Now hopefully, okay, showing them. Here we go. I also want to go to shaded view. These texture maps are so large. Oh, I've got the override on, so that's what's happening. Not a problem. So when I select the object, you'll see that these ISO curves are very closely spaced. That is actually done through the command edit rebuild to the surface. I just made a simple loft to get this ground in the scene here. I used about 6 or 7 curves, lofted them, pretty simple, pretty easy to do. The next step, though, is to rebuild it, and that just gives us more control points, which helps the displacement material push and pull the surface. And the rule of thumb I have used is make sure those are about a foot across. If I hadn't rebuilt them, they would probably be 20 feet, or these control points is really what we're looking at, control points of the surface. This is a very detailed surface, but it's pretty much necessary for the displacement to happen. So turn those off. And I think this material is, if I go to my texture mapping, it's repeating 12 times. So that map is probably filling in a space right about here, and then it goes 12 and 12. So it's a combination of the map being extremely high resolution, displacement being carefully calculated, and then that rebuild feature we talked about, edit, rebuild. I'm not sure if I show that. Edit, rebuild, and you get this. So you want the U's and V's to be cranked up. The values may differ. I try to use numbers that get me to about a foot or less across in my scene. This is pretty important. If there was left at the defaults, it just wouldn't work nearly as well. I can give you a quick example of that. If I were just to take a normal surface. So the control points on a quick, simple surface are only on the corners. This would be a horrible thing to do. So you could make it work fantastic with that edit rebuild. And instead of the U's and V's being the default values, I'll say give me 32 in each direction. Hit OK. And now with the rebuilding, that displacement's going to work way better. Again, you don't want to have these things edited. you just pretty much want to get your final design. It's too much pain to edit. Get your final design, maybe save a copy if you think you want to go back, and then do the edit rebuild, and then just kind of leave it alone. With so many control points, it's no fun to edit. So those are the keys for the grass and where to get it.
Great. I think we need a part 2 for sure. Anyway, I'm gonna go with the last question, and I just want to mention that you're getting great feedback. Like, thank you, great webinar, spelled all capital with 5 exclamation point marks. So great, excellent. So what landscape library did you use for this scene? And do you have any suggestion for landscape libraries in general?
Yeah, there's actually not too much landscaping materials here. Oh, you must mean the trees. Okay, so the grass I already talked about. Yes, these trees here, I got to give people kind of a word of warning. I get a lot of free stuff on the web, you know, and they just they have problems. So I recommend, if you can afford it. I mean, there's tons of free stuff, so I don't want to discount that. That's great to learn, but you know, if you're doing professional quality work, I typically buy stuff, and the reason is, I mean, they just put so much time and effort into these maps and the geometry and the text, how the maps are applied. I mean, that's a lot of work. So these are from Dosh Design. They're a huge company. They do a lot of texture maps and 3D objects. So I think all of the trees in this scene, there might be 3 different trees. Those are all from Dosh Design. The grass I mentioned was from built into the Express toolbar, so that's made by the Chaos Group, the V-Ray guys. These rocks are actually from SpeedTree. So we didn't really have the, I kind of pulled them out. Let's take a quick look at, I think I have one rendering. Yeah, this magnificent oak tree here in the background was from SpeedTree. So I believe the website's speedtree.com. And I just didn't use them for this webinar because it's so much data, kind of slows everything down. And it includes these rocks. So they do, if you have to be photorealistic and close up, there's no better company than SpeedTree. So I think they have an application where you can actually design your own tree. They've been used in a lot of movies and video games. I've played around with it a little bit, but it's just amazingly complicated. So this is actually one of their sample products. So that's SpeedTree. So I think that's it for the stuff I used. Most of the other, oh, I can mention the people. That's kind of considered, I classify as entourage, you know. I consider the ground, the trees, and the people all entourage. So those are from, I think those are from AXYZ Design. We can maybe throw all these links into the show notes. Actually, I just remembered I do have them listed one place. If you go to my website here, I kind of do this as putting all my recommendations in one spot. So if I go to my lynda.com courses, and here's the most recent course. Everything I've talked about today is explained way slower and in greater detail if you watch the course. But here's all the partners. So I used Viz People for the HDR skies we saw. Dosh Design was for the trees and materials. SpeedTree was for that super high-res tree. And then the people are AXYZ Design. So those are right there on my Professor 3D website with direct links.
That is fantastic, Dave. You couldn't have answered better. I just got a lot of answer to the proposal of webinar part 2, and overwhelmingly everybody's typing in yes, yes, yes. So I'm gonna hold you accountable for that. Okay?
You can't get this?
No, you can't.
Right.
Okay. I would like to take the screen back, and sorry for taking away this beautiful visual. And I wanted to apologize for the beginning mishaps with the sound. I hope you know it's all being recorded with sound. So, and I know a lot of people had trouble, and I don't know why. I blame the penguins. I don't know. Yeah. So I want to thank everybody for attending this webinar. Thank you from the Novedge team. And I want to remind everybody to visit our page at noveg.com and check out V-Ray 2.0 for Rhino 4 and 5. Penguins not included. Noveg is the best way to buy design software online. For information on the latest specials and new releases, join the Noveg network on Facebook, Google+, or Twitter, and subscribe to the Noveg blog. Next webinar is a surprise. It's going to be in 3 weeks, so look on our social media. There'll be announcements soon. I'm reminding everybody that to watch today's webinar or previous ones, check our Noveg YouTube or Vimeo channels. Our webinar playlist has webinars for every software taste, and they'll be sound. So thanks again for joining us, and I want to give a huge thanks to Dave and to Fernando Rentas, who was behind the scene. It's been a pleasure, and stay tuned and look forward to the second installment of all Dave's tips and tricks, right? Would you say, Dave? Do we have you signed on?
I'm here. Thank you, Barbara and Fernando and everybody who tuned in.
Okay, to the next time then. Bye-bye, everybody.